We are specifically focused on first-time fund managers, and I think with the view of hoping that we can increase the number of second, third, fourth-time fund managers that really would be a fit for these institutional asset allocators. Most of those institutional investors are not going to touch a fund one, period.
I'm Bryce Butler from Access Ventures, and this is More Than Profit, a show where I talk with founders, investors, entrepreneurs, and leaders of all kinds about living and working with purpose, how they do it, and why. Our guest today is Maegan Moore, the director of Catalyze, a national initiative democratizing access to capital, networks, and resources for the next generation of capital entrepreneurs who are moving in innovative and inspiring ways. Her background in art and her upbringing as the daughter of a higher education professional that took her from Waco, Texas to Seattle, Washington, and to Lexington, Kentucky gave her a deep appreciation of place and the importance of community. All of this has shaped who she is as she set out in 2022 to launch with some colleagues a new effort to find and support emerging fund managers that simply lack access to networks and capital to be successful. I
grew up not in one place. I grew up moving all over the country a lot. We were not a military family. My dad was in higher education and took us kind of to a lot of different places throughout my childhood, and a lot of very different places. So we lived in Seattle, Washington in the 90s. We lived in Waco, Texas, wow, Kentucky, kind of all over the place. And
what did he do in higher education?
He was in administration. He taught. He kind of did a whole range of things. But I think, and Bryce, I think you moved a lot as well.
I know that experience.
Yeah, I think sometimes people think about, moving can kind of make you not feel super connected to any particular place. And I think it kind of had the opposite effect on me. I think I became this lover of place. And because we lived in all these very distinct, different types of cities and communities, I sort of became really interested and kind of obsessed with what makes a place tick, and what makes people love the place that they live, and what contributes to a robust community or economy or kind of, just a local place. And
is there anything your parents did to kind of foster that as you were moving from place to place?
Yeah.
Did they try to make it exciting because they knew how traumatic sometimes moving could be?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think they were just really great at helping us kind of adjust to where we were, and even just as far as getting to know like local businesses and getting out and kind of like understanding the culture that we were living in, and really helping narrate the difference between like a Seattle, Washington versus a Waco, Texas versus Lexington, Kentucky, just like very different communities. And they just did a great job.
How many siblings did you have?
2.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how was it for them?
I think a little harder. They moved, the timings of our moves were a little bit more challenging. Like they both moved mid high school, and I got to do my entire high school in Lexington. So probably a little bit harder, but I think similarly they would say made them very adaptable and drawn to being like really inclusive, because I think anywhere that we went, it mattered a lot that there was someone who was willing to say, come sit at my table and like come be a part of this. And when you're like a middle schooler going to your first day of 7th grade and someone's like, do you want to sit by me? That like changes you.
Yeah, that's hard. Yeah, it was always hard for us moving. I'm similar to you. Like moving was exciting. Moving was an opportunity to learn new things, reimagine myself. Like, oh, this didn't work there. I'll just change that when I move over
That's
here.
Right.
It was harder for my siblings. So it's interesting, I think, person by person. But so that kind of ingrained in you a love of place, this fascination with communities and how they work. So how did that take you forward into what you ended up studying in university, and then later now, what you're doing with Catalyze?
Yeah. So my undergrad degree was kind of a mix of political science and business, and I actually had a minor in studio art, and kind of care a lot about how creatives kind of impact communities and kind of their role within communities, and just was really interested, I think, even in college, in sort of an interdisciplinary approach to anything. And after college, I ended up moving to Charlottesville, Virginia, another place with a very strong local identity, and working at UVA on a project called Thriving Cities, which really is just an academic project that was sort of looking at the question of what does it mean and take to thrive in today's world, and kind of more importantly, who gets to participate in thriving.
I'm familiar with Thriving Cities.
Yeah.
I think more people should be familiar with Thriving Cities.
Yeah.
So, give us a picture. What is the initiative around Thriving Cities, and ultimately the goal that Josh and you and others had in building that? Because I hear what you're saying. I think there's a lot of conversation and a lot of passion around place.
Yeah.
Because I think we all exist and live and belong to a community.
That's right.
But there hasn't been a ton of thought work until, I believe, even Thriving Cities around, well, what makes a place tick?
Right.
What makes it thrive? And how do we identify when it's not thriving? And how do we identify when it is? And how do we support those things?
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe explain it a little bit further.
Yeah. So, I mean, Thriving Cities started with the goal of creating tools that could help people measure thriving and sort of identify like what metrics and tools for measurement could we use beyond GDP and beyond some of these sort of like one-dimensional tools. Like, how do we actually take a more systemic and sort of comprehensive approach to looking at what it sort of means to be thriving in a city, and education for everyone. And it's not going to be, affordable housing. It's going to be some mix of sort of many different interventions. And one layer on top of that is that it's different in every place. Like, the history of a place and the context of a place matters massively. And so you can't there's no one size fits all silver bullet for.
Which had to be huge for a young person, how this affected you. Because that's an education in itself.
Totally.
So.
And I think it resonated. Like, I think back to moving, like, it resonated with me because I thought the tech boom in the 90s in Seattle versus like what is required to help Waco become a thriving community. Like, those are just different places, and there's similarities and there's overlaps and all of that. But like, it resonated with my experience of like all the different places I lived and kind of how they were just had a different DNA. And kind of
what was your role there? What did you?
Yeah, I mean, my first job out of college was I was like a research assistant. I just sort of helped Josh in the early days with research, and we ended up actually spinning the project out of the university and creating a nonprofit organization so that we could do a little bit more hands-on work with city leaders and nonprofit leaders and investors, and so kind of ended up doing operations and a whole host of things when we spun it out.
Yeah, and what I love, because I love systems thinking, systems theory.
He loves it.
Loves it. Yeah, I mean,
big systems guy.
Yeah, I'm a big systems guy, and I think oftentimes though, I wish more people did that, because the essence of Thriving Cities is systems thinking. It's that we don't exist isolated in and of ourselves, but we exist in and with other people. And what happens in those other relationships does affect us in ways that are positive and negative. And so, it's like you can't separate that out. But I do think what happens oftentimes, and then I think this is kind of full circle to kind of some of the things you're working on now. If you don't take that integrated approach, we end up slicing out and bringing one thing. And that fits a specific need, but it doesn't answer the system's problems. It doesn't answer the community's challenges holistically. And so I think, how do we take more of a holistic approach? Whether it's a holistic approach to the person, we were talking about that at breakfast. Yeah. Like, we've got to start thinking about the full dynamics of a human being and what makes them tick and survive and thrive. Same thing with a community.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I think it's it's harder, and it can feel confusing, and it can be harder to raise money for. Like, there's all sorts of reasons people zero in on a sort of specific focus, and it's great. And I think even if for people who do, learning to ask the questions that surround that thing and sort of say, what are the downstream effects of this? And like, what what is the context of this community and what does it mean for them versus this other place?
Well, I just think human nature is to be focused in on typically one thing. So I think it's great as a young person, you got this overall that these ecosystems are affected by everything. So there's
Right.
not one thing. And yeah, that's great. So you did that, and then you went to Oxford.
Went to business school. Yeah. So I think, in that work and my years at Thriving Cities, there was for me, I became really interested in one dimension or aspect of thriving, which was around kind of equal access or the ability to sort of dignify people through giving them opportunity, like economic opportunity or access to good jobs or sort of the ability to create community wealth or generational wealth. And so I think ended up kind of naturally deciding to go to business school and kind of wanting to be around questions of how do we help founders and small local businesses that really do make up the DNA of these communities, and founders and entrepreneurs, how do we make sure that everyone, even in kind of overlooked communities, has access to the resources and the networks they need to kind of be a thriving business owner or a founder or an entrepreneur.
So you grew up moving around.
Yep.
End up going to college, studied some art, which I think is quite fascinating. It's surprising. I mentioned that because the number of people I talk to that end up doing really cool things in business that have their start in art, which is, I don't know, it's another thing to think about. Then you had this experience with Thriving Cities and then off to Oxford. And then I think you and I met as you were shifting into Blueprint, I believe.
Probably
which
so.
Was after that point as well.
Yeah.
So talk to us about kind of that work. What brought you to Blueprint Local, which was focused on opportunity zones, but from that kind of has come this new work as well. So help give us a picture of, Oxford into all of these other things.
Yeah. So I think again, sort of post Oxford was really interested in these questions of capital access and connecting innovators and businesses and founders, but was really interested in the communities that were traditionally not served by the capital markets. And so, and that's again, kind of goes back to my background, living in a bunch of places that just traditionally, they're just not New York, SF, Boston, Lexington, Kentucky. How do we make sure that founders and businesses in Lexington kind of have the same access to resources and opportunities as a founder in New York? And met Ross right as I was moving back to the U.S. And for those of you who know Ross Barrett, he's great thinker and innovator around these questions of kind of capital, and particularly in kind of overlooked communities around the U.S. And the opportunity zone piece of this was really interesting. I think I loved the place-based constraint of it. I loved that it was sort of place-based, and the way Ross was thinking about it in particular was very placemaking and kind of all in on a single community, inspired very much by your work, Bryce, obviously in Louisville. And I joined with the real interest of, I loved the real estate work, but was really interested in the early OZ days around the business investing. And how do we both create physical infrastructure in these communities, but then an empty building with not a bunch of thriving businesses is just not going to fix anything. And so was really interested in how do we capitalize and sort of support local businesses to sort of fill the spaces that we're building in these communities.
Yeah, and so now what you're working on with Catalyze is kind of the outflow of that. But I do know, because you and I have talked about it, that wasn't an easy journey, because I mean you came in with this passion and vigor, and we both know Ross and he's amazing, but the opportunity zone lens changed.
That's right.
And so what was that like for you? So
Yeah.
you're working at this company with this idealism around kind of doing both the real estate and the operating companies.
Yeah.
You're passionate about supporting wealth creation in these communities through businesses, but that shifts.
Yeah.
What was that like?
It was hard and disappointing, and it was happening in parallel with my own personal life was changing. I met my now husband, and ended up moving to New York City, which was not a place I ever anticipated living. I mean, again, I have this love for sort of like smaller, like, communities and loved my years in Charlottesville and just never imagined living in New York. And so I think I also felt quite disconnected from our work physically. And then COVID happened and we couldn't even sort of travel to see the projects. And so the work that was meant to be so place-based and hands-on and kind of understanding the DNA of a community ended up being just very abstract and disconnected from the day-to-day. And
do you like living in New York now?
Yeah, it's grown on me a lot. I think the thing about New York that people said to me and I didn't totally understand is like there's a million little communities within Manhattan. And so we live in a neighborhood in Upper Manhattan, and that has a particular identity that's different than the Lower East Side. And so I've kind of learned to wrap my head around that or my arms around that in a different way. But I think I do miss at times being somewhere smaller that feels like I can maybe wrap my head around a little bit more.
At Access Ventures, we envision a world where small business owners can access the capital they need to improve on their early traction, and where entrepreneurs can secure capital that works for their businesses by leveraging equitable collateral that can be acquired regardless of class, race, or gender. Over a period of 8 years from 2014, we modeled and tested our growth loan fund. Over that time period, we loaned over $1 million and activated and empowered a community of volunteers to serve as a loan committee and support their fellow community members by saying yes instead of no when they needed capital. This playbook is an open-sourced culmination of the steps we took and the lessons we learned in building a community-first character lending process. To learn more and begin your journey to character-based lending, you can download the playbook from the show notes to this episode. Now back to the show. Yeah, but it's helpful to understand because the context of, I think everybody's been there. They go through a company, they come in like, okay, this is what we're doing, but things begin to shift.
Yeah.
Sometimes unintentionally, sometimes intentionally. And I think the legislation changed.
Yeah.
COVID happened.
Yeah.
And so that forced a ton of focusing, I think, for a lot of people. The economy.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, what was potentially going to be this utopian strategy of kind of collective impact, business investing in real estate, soberly made some decisions to focus in on the real estate.
That's right.
And then to leave kind of the cross collaboration and business stuff to other community partners.
Yeah.
So you realize that.
Yep.
You're moving to a new city.
Yep.
Disconnected from the things that you're doing, but you still have this passion.
Yeah.
So what did you do with that?
Yeah. So I mean, to Ross's credit, which I don't think every boss or founder would do this. I think he had a personal passion for this as well, and so he kind of let me carve out a little portion of work at Blueprint that was very much connected to the work of the real estate investing, but somewhat separate. And we ended up getting funding from the Economic Development Administration to do some work around innovative capital products, so non-traditional bank lending and venture capital. And it made a lot of sense because it was asking these questions of like, how do we sort of increase capital access for small businesses? And so while we weren't investing in the small businesses in the real estate projects the way we'd originally hoped, we were doing a lot of work to say, okay, we just built this food hall in Richmond, Virginia, and there's a bunch of local entrepreneurs who can't access traditional debt capital. Like, what would be the right types of capital for those businesses, and who in Richmond is working to provide those, and how do we maybe connect some dots and get those businesses to get the resources they need to kind of thrive. And so was able to do that work for about a little over 2 years at Blueprint, and then 2 years in kind of said, I'm not sure a real estate investment firm is the place for this to live long term. And so Ross, in his great way, like incubated it for a couple of years, and then we decided to spin it out kind of on our own.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's helpful because I think, some of our listeners, they may have a portion of their business that's they don't understand or they're passionate about, but it doesn't quite fit. So to take the risk like Ross did, but also, I mean, to your credit, the boldness that you showed in saying like, this is what I'm actually most interested in. Is there a place for me to do that here? How do we make that happen?
Yeah.
And to now carry that forward into a new thing is pretty impressive.
Yeah. Thanks.
You've meandered in life, and that's what's got,
Yeah.
Connected you to place.
Yeah.
But she was always connected to place.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She wasn't meandering with place because you'd always loved place.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah, but it's been a non-linear
yeah.
journey for sure.
place.
Like,
Well, and I
But
think
that's life,
because it's
yeah.
helpful, because I think a lot of times when I hear people talking about a passion for place, it's a place they've lived in for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, because it's really easy to have an affinity for your hometown where you were born and raised and you grew up. But like you and I can constant expatriates of
That's right.
everywhere.
That's right.
What does it look like to have an affinity for a place, and how can you come into a new place and love it for what it is and try to make it better? Which I think is a word that a lot of people need to kind of hear and embrace. So
Yeah, that's really good.
what are some, I'm curious, we've gotten a little bit of the kind of the blueprint, trying to think through that, but what are some pivotal or painful moments or experiences that have kind of shaped who you are as you kind of press forward into what Catalyze is doing?
Two things in my sort of experience with Blueprint that I think sort of maybe subconsciously sort of shaped what we're working on now at Catalyze is, one was just, we were, Blueprint was focused on kind of small to mid-tier cities across the mid-Atlantic, Southeast, and Texas. And so we were doing all this work in just sort of like smaller secondary, tertiary cities. And I think being on the ground and having conversations with developers and also business owners, and who were so deeply passionate about what they were building, and who knew, like, we sometimes discredit the knowledge of locals in their community. And like, I think they knew what their communities needed. And they just were struggling to gain access to the resources that they needed to kind of make that happen. And there's like so many reasons we could talk about why that is, but that kind of the size of project, the size of city, that just, so there's a project in Greenville, South Carolina that is led by a guy, and he is so thoughtful about what Greenville needs and the local community, and he's building this beautiful co-working space and retail space and all of this really interesting, a really interesting project. And it's just a little bit too big and risky for local Greenville investors. And it's just not big enough and risky enough for like a Blueprint. And so he is just falling in between these two sort of sources of capital. And we saw tons of those projects that you just want to see them come to fruition, and they just couldn't. And hopefully will at some point. But I think having to say no as an investor is really hard, is probably what I would say is one of the things.
I think that's a good thing to highlight, because, especially now with the work at Catalyze, capital has a role, and it has a stage, and it has a focus. And there are so many projects, we're the same way, that I'd love to say yes to.
Yeah.
On principle, it's like, I love it.
Yeah.
Makes sense. I actually see it making money. It just doesn't fit.
Yeah.
And then the number of entrepreneurs, or the number of developers that hear that, and then how that's difficult in a market like Greenville, because it is small. So like you said, I mean, that is the story of Mid-America.
That's right.
I mean, that is the story. It's a project that's too big for our local capital, but it's too small for the other types of capital.
That's right.
So what do they do?
That's right.
And oftentimes these projects just don't move forward.
Yeah.
So that's the travesty.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And I think the other thing I saw in my work at Blueprint, that probably has very much informed what we're working on at Catalyze, is just like a lack of diversity in the investment manager space. So we at Blueprint co-invested with a lot of different investors, and got to have conversations with tons of OZ and non-OZ investors, and then even our own sort of conviction at Blueprint to say we would love for our portfolio of developers and projects to be led by a diverse set of developers. And that was really hard. And so beginning to ask some of these questions, like why is the investment management space so not diverse. And if people in the investment decision seat if there's not diversity in that on that layer of the system, then it makes a lot of sense why there's such a challenge with capital access on the founder or developer level, that there's a real lack of diversity in terms of where capital is flowing. So
now that we've kind of come to Catalyze. Give us the 30-second kind of, what is Catalyze? What are you guys hoping to do?
Yeah. So we talk a lot about backing capital entrepreneurs is sort of our term for this. So for us, capital entrepreneurs are investors that are typically moving capital in meaningful and inspiring ways. But for us, that means usually underrepresented fund managers. So people of color, female fund managers, and or fund managers that are trying to scale innovative capital products and sort of add to the capital ecosystem different structures and investment products that would fit a broader set of businesses.
Now, so I'm going to just play the other side real quick.
Okay.
So why does that matter? I mean, because like if a person, if you're a female fund manager, you want to go raise a fund, why is that so hard?
Yeah.
Especially in today's market. Like why is there such a challenge? Like why can't you just go do that?
Yeah. Great question. I think that, underrepresented fund managers, female fund managers, face a lot of the same challenges and barriers that underrepresented and female founders do. They often lack access to a personal network of wealth or investors or sort of personal assets that would allow them to go start a fund, which is a very expensive endeavor, and one that you typically don't pay yourself for a long time, and kind of requires some. I mean, capital is like relationships, and so if you don't have the relationships of someone who's going to say, "Yeah, I'll write you a seed check," or "I'll be your first LP," or "I'll fund your personal life for a year while you get this off the ground," and traditionally the kind of investors and sort of high-level capital allocators aren't in relationship with a lot of the underrepresented fund managers or even sort of female fund managers. I think they face a lot of barriers to kind of breaking into that space, and then, kind of getting past fund one, which is often the hardest, and kind of getting onto fund two, fund three, where you have some track record and have access to institutional investors, just tends to be really challenging.
Yeah, and I think a lot of institutional money that is placing into new funds, I think there's a lot of misconceptions too, and which is somewhat of what I was trying to highlight too, which is you can't just walk out and have been a successful entrepreneur and then all of a sudden turn around and be an investor.
That's right.
Because what people don't understand is, to your point, you're going to drop at least $100,000 in setting up your fund documents.
Easily.
So who has $100,000 to do that? And to your other point, you don't really take a paycheck until the fund closes. And so your fundraise could be 12 to 18 months. And then when you do close it, your first fund is not going to be significant enough to pay yourself a ton, let alone anybody else to help you. And so I think those hurdles a lot of time. And then the antiquated structure of how, if you're going to be the GP, you've got to bring skin to the game.
That's right.
So there's a lot of these other hurdles where, like, okay, Bryce Butler, I want to go start a fund. 1, do I have the network that has money? 2, do I have enough personal wealth to not take a paycheck for 12 to 18 months while I'm raising the fund? 3, do I have enough personal wealth to bring money to the table so that I can participate as a general partner in the structure that many people perceive as a fund? So those are some of the major hurdles that I think a lot of emerging fund managers face.
So how does Catalyze bridge this?
Yeah. So I think I think that's exactly right, Bryce, and such a good summary. So we basically set out to, we do a couple of different things, but one of them is we run a fund fellowship program. We're on our second cohort this year. We're in the selection process, actually. And what we're really trying to do is kind of bring in these first-time fund managers, specifically underrepresented fund managers, and come alongside them as fund builders and kind of operational support. And it's 6 months, and we're really trying to not be prescriptive around it being education based or curriculum. Like, I think we're really trying to say, where are you in your journey? How can we help? Like, a lot of them are solo GPs, which is a like really challenging and lonely experience. And just say, like, how can we sort of support you in your journey and hopefully kind of increase the odds of their success. And the other kind of key piece of our program that's, I think, very unique is we give them flexible operating capital. We just write them a check and say, use this on fund related activities. But like, if you need a website, or you need to pay some legal fees, or you need to travel to a conference to meet some LPs, like, here's some cash to do it, because we've learned that is such a significant barrier for a lot of these fund managers.
Yeah, good.
And are you guys, are you all getting into educating the capital allocators themselves? Because the other thing I found is, one, they don't understand that the difficulties of that road. I think the other piece is they don't understand the when they turn even to, because if you're a capital allocator, so you're a high net worth individual and you've got money, you talk to somebody, you all of a sudden have a relationship. So back to this idea of place, like, oh, Maegan, I love that idea. That sounds great. I'm interested. But what I do is I turn to my accountants and my wealth managers, and they have a whole host of then like diligence questions in order to, basically say that they're living out their fiduciary responsibilities, which again, I think they should define a little bit further. And then they'll come back and they'll tell this high net worth individual, we can't do that fund.
Yeah.
We've got too much exposure in private investments. It's too risky. It's too early. Let's wait till fund 2.
Yep.
What does education like that look? Because that's the other side to really, one, it's to support these emerging fund managers. Number 2, it's getting capital allocators closer to them.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I think we're trying to do a few different things in this realm. So one is, we are specifically focused on first-time fund managers. And I think with the view of hoping that we can increase the number of second, third, fourth-time fund managers that really would be a fit for these institutional asset allocators. Most of those institutional investors are not going to touch a fund 1, like, period. And so our hope is like, let's help you have a track record, have a successful first fund, build an institutional firm, so that on fund 2, fund 3, an institutional investor is like, great, we're in. But then I think there's some creative ways for foundations and family offices and high net worths to be playing in the space more. So
in how though?
Yeah. So some of the listeners might be familiar with the Capital Access Lab, which was an initiative of the Kauffman Foundation. And the Capital Access Lab was a really cool program because it was Kauffman taking grant money and putting it into a donor-advised fund. And from that donor-advised fund, writing LP checks to 6 first-time fund managers. And massive, because Kauffman, being an LP and a first-time fund manager, has huge signaling effect for other LPs. They say, "Oh, Kauffman's in. Like, this must be legit. This is great." And that's like a really creative way for a foundation like Kauffman to take grant capital and support a first-time fund manager, because their endowment's not going to touch a first-time fund manager. And the Capital Access Lab was really amazing. I mean, it's still kind of in its life, but I think they invested in 6 first-time fund managers. Probably folks would know a lot of them. Collab Capital is one of them. 1863 Ventures, Founders First. And I think the statistics are like, it's 96% of the founders in the portfolio of those funds are from underrepresented backgrounds. So as we sort of talk about, like, why does this layer of the system matter? Like, we're beginning to see how capital flows through into kind of these founders that typically don't access capital.
So where do you go from here? Obviously, Catalyze spun out of Blueprint, I think earlier this year,
Yeah.
Or maybe late last year. But where does that go? And then more specifically, how does it help Maegan get to what she wants to do in her life?
Thanks. I'll answer the first part. I don't have to think about the second, but I think on the first part, I think we always anticipate that the fund fellowship will be smaller, high touch, very personal relationship. Like, we don't ever want it to be this massive, highly scalable thing. And with the hopes that sort of our alums from the program go on to build Fund 2, Fund 3, Fund 4, and that we can continue kind of supporting them. And I think we would love eventually to be asset allocators ourselves. I think we're beginning to think about launching a GP vehicle or sort of a vehicle that would help extend capital beyond sort of our flexible grant capital, sort of extend like a low interest loan to these GPs, or sort of help them warehouse some deals. So beginning to think about how do we actually aggregate capital to support these fund managers ourselves. And then continuing the other side of the Catalyze work is the innovative finance work, which is sort of a little bit more in the R&D phase. But how do we help fund managers and asset allocators be more comfortable with and sort of adopt and scale these products that fall between venture capital and traditional lending, and are really just a fit for so many more businesses in the U.S.
Who would be people you'd love to partner with? I mean, obviously, family offices would be,
high net worths. I mean, there's a handful of family offices right now that are doing amazing work and that are willing to write checks to first-time GPs. And I think
you would help them vet and do all that stuff.
we would love to help. Like, we've talked a lot about doing sort of a OCI, outsourced CIO work, or sort of diligence work on funds for foundations or family offices that maybe want to have more diversity in their investment portfolio, but don't have the internal capacity to vet, to sort of do the diligence on the funds. And we have this great pipeline. We have an amazing pipeline of first-time fund managers that we just closed our applications, and we'll ultimately select, I think, 5 to 10 fund managers for this cohort. But we had 120 applications of first-time fund managers, so many of whom were qualified and would have been an amazing fit for the program. So there's clearly demand for this, and I think there's just incredible investment opportunities. We'd love to get more.
And how much would a family office need to kind of carve out for that you would see as meaningful?
Yeah. I mean, it depends so much on the fund size, but a lot of these first-time GPs are kind of doing funds that are sub 25 million, sort of the 10 to 25 million. And so even a $500,000 check is super meaningful, especially from a family office or a foundation that kind of can be a signal to other LPs to say, oh, like, that foundation's behind you. Like, we'll look harder at this.
To learn more about Catalyze and the great work Maegan and her team are doing to support these emerging capital entrepreneurs, check out catalyze.community. As always, thanks for listening, and stay up to date by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, drop us a review so others can find us as well. You can learn more about what's ahead for this podcast by visiting our new website, morethanprofit.fm, or following us on Twitter at listen_NTP, or on Instagram at More Than Profit Podcast. More Than Profit is a production of Access Ventures. Direction, design, and editing is done by our friends at Render, a public benefit innovation studio in Louisville, Kentucky. To learn more about their work, check out workwithrender.com. I'm Bryce Butler, and you've been listening to More Than Profit.